Welcome to Stars Board, a podcast that I created during the COVID-19 pandemic, where our mission is to amplify the voices of artists that inspire us to engage in the now. So this episode is a series of conversations in conjunction with the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, where we hope to serve students like yourself by holding space for theater makers native to each region of artists. Helping me moderate is Ryan Duncan Ayala, the founder of El Centro Productions and an alum of KCACTF, and my producer. And at the recording of this episode, we are only 9 days into the new year, and already a runoff election in Georgia has determined that the balance of power will flip to the Democratic Party. An insurrection of Capitol Hill happened and divided and shook our populace, and amidst the incitement of the insurrection, our leader has been blocked on social media. It is a crazy moment that uproots the fundamental inequities COVID has exposed in race, class, and hierarchy. So I can't think of a better guest for this moment than Broadway producer Rachel Sussman. She just produced the critically acclaimed work, What the Constitution Means to Me. It was a Pulitzer finalist. She's a Tony nominee, and she took it to Broadway. She's the co-founder of the Mitten Lab, an emerging artist residency program in her native state on Michigan, focused on nurturing the next generation of theater artists. And she's a fierce proponent of intersectionality of art and social justice, serving on the artist impact team of the Broadway Advocacy Coalition. And Hal Prince has praised Rachel for her boundless enthusiasm. Boundless enthusiasm I intend to heavily indulge. So welcome, Rachel Sussman.
Thank you. Thanks, Keith and Ryan. I'm so happy to be here.
We were just talking about it, but let's talk about it again. How are you feeling today in midst of all this?
You know, it in many ways is overwhelming. And when I think about the experience of coming to the last gasp of this administration, how just desensitized we've all become, that it took a coup for folks to really, for Twitter and Facebook to be like, you know what, this is the last straw. And, you know, I feel at once so hopeful that Democrats are going to have control of the House and the Senate and the presidency. And also, you know, very cautious about what the next 11 days will look like until we get there.
Even this event that happened on Wednesday, nobody could have ever thought something like this would happen. People are already downplaying, and it just blows my mind that we've come this far. You know, something like this hasn't happened. Something as crazy as this hasn't happened since 9/11. And then it was all eyes were on one thing. And now it's just okay, let's move on. And I'm like, what? No, what? Let's not move on yet. Okay.
And I think the election, as positive as the outcome has been, it really showed us how divisive and divided this country is. And if there are no consequences for the actions of Wednesday, you know, we just look at history, look at Nazi Germany for what's possible in terms of historically how people will behave when they are not given consequences for their actions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating because only in a moment like this, where a Jewish man and a Black man have uprooted the state that had oppressed those identities for so long, I think it actually makes perfect sense to me that this would happen. My dad is, I'm also Jewish, and my dad has warned me. He's like, yeah, you are advocating, and like yourself, I consider myself an ally for Black lives and really any BIPOC artists that are marginalized in our industry and beyond. And he's like, okay, and do that and be that, but also remember where you're from. And I'm like, well, those are two different, I almost felt like it was a false equivalency because of how Judaism was treated in Europe versus here. But my dad is like, oh, no, that's wrong, because this is also real. Both can coexist. And
right.
Yeah.
And those folks who are white supremacists are, as we know, also largely anti-Semitic and xenophobic and homophobic and all sorts of things that would keep them as cis, white, primarily men, out of power. And they're so fearful of allowing this world to actually treat everyone in an equitable way.
I definitely want to be able to understand where they come from and understand why they're angry. And to some level, I can see it. There's all sorts of reasons that measure it. But what it comes down to is just a refusal to not accept reality. And I don't know how to reconcile that.
Yeah.
But
I think it's primarily fear-based. I think it's this notion of, you know, I don't want to speak in generalities, but I can make the assumption a lot of these folks probably don't live in communities where they see people who look or behave differently from them. And so, you know, for me, I live in New York City. I grew up in like Metro Detroit area. And so that to me, it's always been treat everyone with kindness and fairness and compassion. And I think for folks who have for so long not had to think about that, and in particular, some of those folks who came in to this insurrection and like, quite frankly, they're domestic terrorists with Confederacy flags after everything we've gone to trying to remove these monuments and what they represent for Black Americans in particular. It's so painful. And yet again, to see someone like Leader Stacey Abrams do what she did in Georgia, this Black woman who lost the gubernatorial race and yet came back with this like beautiful vengeance to change Georgia. And not only did the Democrats win Georgia and Georgia went blue, but then we got 2 Senate seats, like unprecedented and extraordinary.
My God. And
it's all, you know, it's a pendulum swing in some ways as well. And right now it feels like so extremist, and hopefully this new presidency, Biden and Harris and the Democratic Senate and House can help to heal and make change for the better, because we need it. And I mean, this vaccine distribution is not going well. So, you know, that's why I'm like January 20th can't come soon enough. And I'm hopeful for the change. That's my big thing I'm a hopeful person. I'm not an optimistic person. To me, they're not the same thing. I subscribe to the Rebecca Solnit way of thinking, which is optimism is the belief things will turn out well without taking action. And hope is the belief that in the space of the unknown is room for you to take action. So it depends on what we collectively do.
I've taken actions to question myself and all that, and question our practices. And the people that are going to be the people that change the world, and already have. Like, it's already clear, like, how much power we actually are going to be holding in 2 weeks. I still don't think we've actually fully accepted that yet because of so much that's gone on. We haven't fully celebrated because we've had a lot of traffic on the way to the celebration.
The New York Times headline on Friday, it's like in any other year in any other presidency, like Democrats take control of the Senate was like a teeny bottom corner of the front page. It was like Trump insurrection, also pandemic, like all of these sort of like crises compounded together. And I think we're all just like, we have to wait and see. So it feels a little cautious, but hopeful.
How did you find theater for yourself?
I grew up in Oakland County, Michigan, which is, I'm sure so many of you know Oakland County now, and because I know we're in the Midwest region, many of you probably know that. But Oakland County and Wayne County are like the 2 reliable blue counties in Michigan. So they spend a lot of time in November trying to sort of like tune in on those 2 counties. I grew up there I was a competitive dancer as a kid, and then I was signed up for a youth repertory theater with some friends when I was 8, and I did a bunch of shows with this company that like young people shouldn't touch. I was in this company from 4th grade through 9th grade. And we did Julius Caesar and Up the Down Staircase and David Copperfield. Like, in some ways extraordinary that they decided to give young people access to these works, and we put them on in like 4 weeks. So I learned like how to be really efficient. But also like they were terrible. And I feel so bad looking back. I'm like, my parents sat through a lot of really bad youth theater. And I also did community theater with my whole family, my younger sister, my parents, even our dog. It sort of became like a family activity. And I was also very privileged to go to a public school that had an incredible arts program. And there I got to learn not only about acting, but also about dramaturgy and design and some of the other elements that I feel like very often a high school curriculum doesn't necessarily give you. And folks are generally taught there's on stage and then there's like a lot of things off stage. And maybe you get to do run crew, maybe in high school. And I knew I wasn't interested in that, but I loved performing. I was an actor. I played Millie my senior year of high school in Thoroughly Modern Millie.
Wow.
And was the president of the International Thespian Society. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
And I went to NYU to be an actor. I was at Tisch in the Strasberg Institute. And, you know, because I'd had this more comprehensive high school education, I knew I liked some other things. Like I already knew that going into college. And while I was at NYU, part of my agreement with my parents to go to New York instead of University of Michigan in my home state was that I was going to intern and network, which hindsight, I don't really think I knew what those meant, but they seemed like good buzzwords to use. Yeah. And I convinced my parents. And while I was at NYU, I was interning, and I had this incredible internship when I was a sophomore at Second Stage Theater, which is a big off-Broadway theater in New York. And I got to work under the associate artistic director, first as his intern, and then I actually got paid to be his assistant over the summer, Chris Burney, who now runs New York Stage and Film. And I was a fly on the wall for a whole process of developing a new play, which was a Leslie Headland play called Bachelorette. And I had like a true light bulb moment of, oh, I wanna be a part of making the thing. I wanna ask all the big questions and throw paint at the wall and sit in the room with the writer and the director and really have some of these deeper conversations about what we want to create together versus, you know, I had felt at that point as an actor, so often, you know, you're added into the process later unless it's a devised process. Right. So I started to sort of like shift my understanding and made some steps into moving into the world of producing.
Is there anything that you wish that like that Rachel knew when you first started getting into that world?
I felt like I was pretty bold and pretty, I'm a social people person. And so I liked meeting folks, but I wish that I had been less afraid to ask questions. I think I felt like, oh, I'm not supposed to really talk in these situations. And I think actually now that I'm working and I bring in mentees into my processes, like I wish that I had been able to say, I'm curious about X, Y, and Z. Like, why did you say that? Why wouldn't you say this? And maybe I could have learned it a little more quickly than having to sort of over time get the hands-on experience myself to pick some of those things up.
Asking questions is everything to anybody listening right now. Don't think that you're stupid for not knowing something or not being in the privy. That's kind of the point of of what people in power might want you to feel like. Not all, you know, there's some great leaders out there, but I remember I had an internship and I would just like constantly, they had me like basically photocopying old pictures and all that from all of their stuff. And like that was happening for a while. So in turn, I was like, you know what? I'm going to ask a billion questions because like this is my prerogative. You're paying me, luckily. And I was just like, you know, what is the biggest mistake you made when you were 22 bigger than the one you made at 35 to this artistic director? And he was like, no. And I was like, oh, great. And like, no, like you still make mistakes along the way is the idea. Like you don't stop being like, you know, an idiot. Everybody can be, but like you can also, you know, pick yourself up from those mistakes and all that.
I also think that like you learn so much more and remember the mistakes versus the successes, because you think I'm never going to do that again. And I will inscribe it forever in my brain, so I never make the same mistake.
Yeah, and just, I don't know, I feel like so much of where I'm at right now is based on just like building up the courage to ask the question, and I feel like it gets you so much further because it never hurts to ask. Like I started during the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival because I asked if I was too late to apply to a program, and they're like, no, it's fine, just apply. And now here I am. Like it's amazing.
Exactly. And that applies also to, I mean, asking questions in terms of if there's an artist you admire, reaching out to them and asking them for, I mean, right now, everyone is sitting at home. They can give you a 15-minute, 20, 30-minute virtual coffee. And that would never happen unless you have the courage to ask. Exactly.
Or an hour-long podcast. That is literally the structure of how I've made this podcast what it is so far. And it's all independently produced. Ryan is producing it through El Centro Productions. And my instinct was that I lost my touring job for a 5-month contract. This was going to be my first real job. And then I had to move back home, and I had to like accept reality, like a week before Broadway was shut down, mind you, because they don't have the Broadway money to like sit on that decision until it's like, okay, we can't do this. They were like, we're losing funds from the schools because they're aware of what's going on and the theaters. And I ultimately decided that I have nothing to lose anymore because I have nothing to gain from that world out there. There's nothing happening out there right now. It's all here. It's all digital. So yes, you can DM that person and be like, hey, there's no shame in that. I mean, there's obviously courtesy and all that, but you have to be brave. Now it's a beautiful time for theater artists to be brave.
Yeah, and Keith, you know, you started this all from home. You're, you know, still at home. So let's kind of like follow that a little bit. Rachel, you wanted to be here today because the Mitten Lab is, you know, focused in Michigan, and you know, it's a part of home to you. So can you tell us a little bit about what the Mitten Lab is and just what your goals are for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when Ryan and Keith emailed me and they said, do you want to do like this particular group? And I said, actually, if you're doing regions, is there a Midwest region I could speak to? Because that's where I'm from. And I also run this artist residency, which is upstate Northern Michigan, outside of Traverse City, called the Mitten Lab. We had our kickoff in 2015. And it's an acronym. It stands for the Michigan Incubator for Theater Talent Emerging Now, and it's also the shape of the Lower Peninsula, Mitten. Wow. So we thought we were doubly punny. My co-founder, Catherine M. Carter, who's a theater and opera director, she and I met doing that youth rep company when we were kids. And we've remained best friends. And she also lives in New York and goes back and forth to Michigan. And in 2012, 2013, we were having coffee and we were talking about the next generation of theater artists and all of our friends in New York specifically who were creating work, and how there was so much of it. It's so oversaturated, and that we we're wondering, why isn't so much work being created in Michigan? It feels like such fertile ground and such a creative space. In Northern Michigan is so beautiful. We both grew up going to Northern Michigan in the summertime. And Sleeping Bear Dunes is there, which has been named like the most beautiful place in America. And we asked ourselves like this question of, how is our industry cultivating the next generation? And, it feels like we could create a space that could be inspiring to early career artists, because when we investigated existing residency programs, we found they mostly catered to mid-career and established artists, to which we said, so many of those folks, like, they probably have the resources to do their own kind of residency. What about for the folks who are just starting out, and how meaningful this would be to help just elevate them and offer some visibility in addition to the time, space, and support to create and generate new material. So the lab is on 60 acres in Northern Michigan. Currently it's a week long, and we have an open application process for musical theater writers, including like writing pairs, composers and lyricists, as well as playwrights. And our aim is to really expand and be able to one day offer choreographer space as well. But we've partnered with Interlochen School of the Arts and as well as Parallel 45, which is a professional theater company in the Traverse City area. And what we do is together with them, at the end of this week, we culminate in this pay what you can presentation for the community. The Interlochen students have the opportunity to act and participate in these works in progress, which is quite rare for high school students. So this is not in the summer, it's in the fall. So these are the academy students at Interlochen, to be a part of a work that is still in active process. And they're a part of it, as well as Parallel 45 brings in adult actors so they can participate together. And we share, a couple scenes from each of the works that our resident artists have been creating. And so this past year, in July of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic,
oh my God,
Catherine and I looked at each other and we said, what can we do? And we found a way very safely to bring one artist whom is a previous a residency alum, and the Parallel 45 Theater offered her a commission. So she got to come to the lab to work on a commission for this theater company in Michigan. And our goal is really to be able to be a hub and strengthen sort of the new theatrical work that's being developed in Michigan, and help to really have Michigan as a place for work to premiere, because I think there's going to be a real regional renaissance during this period of time outside of New York, especially as we watch theater come back and we can gather again.
Because basically you're finding that all of these theaters are on their own in so many ways, and that because you can't get subscriptions in the seat, what theater looks like changes, and you have to reallocate what you're investing in and sort of reprioritize your values in some ways, because it's not really about making money at this point. It's about investing in the talent, and in some ways, like what you do with the business of Broadway. I would love to hear you talk about that, democratizing that knowledge of, for example, commercial theater producing. So what was the impetus for you to create access for artists to see that knowledge and producers to see that knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, part of it really had to do with seeing that there's this iron curtain that exists between artists and those who work on the business side, and that artists had been historically withheld from all of the sort of business information. And we felt, my co-founders, Erica Rothstein, Heather Shields, and Dana Lerner, that we could actually help to demystify that process, and share this wealth of knowledge, because what this withholding has done is it's created hierarchy, and it's created this hierarchical system with producers at the top and artists sort of closer to the bottom. And we felt like if we're able to share this knowledge with everyone, it's actually going to lead to a more effective and meaningful collaboration across the industry and across the field. And quite frankly, that's where we started. And then in the middle of the pandemic, and as we now have prioritized fighting for racial justice, challenging the systems that are in place, giving artists, now that they're, they have more knowledge as to how the business has historically operated, what should we be questioning? How can we push back? What are solutions that we can achieve together in order to shift this model for commercial theater?
Yeah, and I've noticed, so there's the new Theater Producers of Color organization and workshop coming. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're involved with that, correct?
I'm not actively involved with that, but I am admiring it. Miranda Go, I believe, has founded it. Miranda and I have been in conversation. She talked to me about Business of Broadway and how we started it and what we do. And we wanted to, do all the resource sharing that we could, so she could, as a young producer of color, start this program, which is a 10-week tuition-free producing workshop for BIPOC producers.
So can you talk a little bit about like this new emergence of like the industry standard group and like just, your takes on the future of like the commercial theater world?
Totally. I mean, the industry standard group is a new organization that's focused on creating investment opportunities for BIPOC investors and producers. And it is founded by BIPOC early career commercial producers, including like my dear friend Cynthia Tong and Sammy Lopez, Rashad Chambers, all producers that I highly recommend that all of you look up and get to know, because they're going to be running this industry one day. I feel like for so long, I mean, commercial theater, all theater, but specifically commercial theater, is built on white supremacy. It is an oligopoly. It's basically run by 3 gatekeeping organizations on Broadway, right? Because there are 41 Broadway theaters.
It's the Nederlander and the Schubert, and what's the other one?
Jude Jamison Theater.
Jamison, of course.
And there are other players as well, but the majority of theaters. And so when you think about it, of course, like this is hierarchical. Those theater owners decide which producers and shows are going to end up in their theaters. And so we're having all these conversations, this next generation of which I'm a part, and trying to actively center our BIPOC producing colleagues in those conversations. I'm a part of a few different groups, and mostly at this point, I think there's a lot of questions, but I'm encouraged because I've heard as of late, theater owners are actively, along with the Broadway League, which is the trade organization of which theater owners and producers belong together, which you may question, to really actively examine what anti-racist commercial models could look like and what particular practices we could put into play. I think that on the whole, the next generation is a little bit more radical and is a little bit more changed now. And there are other established producers who certainly, are like, the system's working for me. Why would I want it to change? So there is that sort of tension. But I also think that it feels so much like this next generation is going to continue to push for a more equitable and just system in the commercial space. Again, it's a little different than nonprofit because of the way the economic model is structured, really, and needing to think about the fact that, this is a commercial business. At the end of the day, our job is to make money. So I think that there are ways to create accessibility and really push to allow, in particular, historically marginalized voices and stories to be amplified.
And it's crazy because you do talk about, you said Jamison Theater, and I just saw the other day Mean Girls on Broadway closed. At the August Wilson Theater, that's something I always questioned, but I didn't question it for very long because I was like, well, that's where it was. You know, that's where Jersey Boys was. But then I started thinking about August Wilson, and like, this man's legacy is not represented on the stage that holds his name. And it's crazy to me to think that like Mean Girls ran as long as it could there, when all the time you're seeing theaters go to different theaters, and the impetus to never make space is never there. And we have so many theater artists right now off Broadway specifically, that are commercially off Broadway, I mean, that are reclaiming the mainstream for the Black queer identity and for like the African American experience, and they should be on that stage. I don't know if it's my place to say they should always be on that stage and not make space for other people of color, but at least making that accessible for audiences that see the name August Wilson and like knowing the legacy that upholds. And that doesn't implicate like Tina Fey or anything. I don't think she's just making a show. It's not that bad. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm cool with it. But like, it should be a thought from now on. It should have always been a thought, you know?
Right. And I mean, you know, I work as a producer at Plate Spinner Productions, which is founded by Diana DeMena, and my colleague Brian Moreland and Diana are lead producers on a new play, which would be coming in when theaters reopen, Lots of a Colored Man. And the conversations that we have in our office about, you know, this play on its own is worthy of a Broadway run, but because of the timing and the fact that it is written by a Black playwright and it centers on the Black experience, like, you know, the ways in which the quality of the work should be enough, instead of having to qualify it based on race or gender. And in this moment, you know, folks feeling like, oh, we want to be producing Black work, which we absolutely should. But it's also like, why weren't we just producing that work before, because of the quality of the work?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it feels like it's a very complex conversation in a lot of ways. And I feel like I don't want to subscribe to it just being reduced to, well, we have to just get BIPOC artists work out. No, we want BIPOC artists work out there because it deserves to be out there, because it is high quality work. And just because we're in this particular moment doesn't mean that's the reason why.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work at Syracuse Stage, which had the world premiere of Thoughts of a Colored Man. And my goodness, it was the first show that I saw when I started working there. And I watched it 3 times because I just couldn't get enough of it. And so I am so glad that stories like these, you're absolutely right, the quality of the work speaks for itself. Like, it shouldn't have to be qualified by anything. And so I'm so glad that that we're finally moving in that direction. Even though, the Times had an article where, it's like Black theater is knocking at the door, and it's like, no, like good theater is knocking at the door of Broadway. Like, that's what we should be talking about.
Totally. And I understand that until I talk about this a lot, obviously, as a queer woman, and I produce a lot of women's stories that folks are like, oh, well, we really need to have like a story about women, or, all female design team, and that can really be a headline. And I'm like, sure, yeah, absolutely. If we need to sort of like be the pioneers so that later on that is not a thing anybody cares about, great. But can it just be we're hiring the best? This is like an incredible team for this particular work.
Absolutely.
And we value their vision because of the artists they are, and not because of their gender or their race necessarily.
Yeah.
But I also think in this moment, absolutely, like we do need to be so mindful right now of uplifting artists of color. And hopefully, we will get to a place, an equitable place, where we don't necessarily have to be qualifying everything as much as we have been.
And knowing that your words matter so, so much. Every word that you write, even when you hold power, like talking about the power of the New York Times, for example, they can make or break any Broadway shows, like Tony's success and commercial success. And historically, you've seen that these critics have marginalized theater artists because of their reviews and their lack of awareness and understanding of BIPOC stories being stories, and saying that, and not there's a huge history of like white people like teaching people of color how to act and how they think these institutions should read a machine of like an actor. And I feel like it's almost over, to be honest with you. I think we're almost there. And it's a great transition for what the Constitution means to me, because easily you could go and say that this play is like for a certain person, for a certain identity, when in reality, it's just an intersection for everybody. It's an opening for women, for people of color, for queer people, for anybody from our communities. So talk about bringing that to Broadway and marketing that so that it makes it accessible to everybody. Because the idea of Constitution in your title, that is going to bring a lot of different people, not just people from the left, I assume, right? Did you consider that?
Yeah, I mean, I will also say I was a co-producer on the show. I was
Right.
not a lead producer, and so we had three incredible lead producers, one of whom is my boss, Diana DiMenna, along with Matt Ross and Aaron Glick. And so they were really the decision makers. And for those of you who are interested in commercial producing, I am more than happy to break down for you, the various roles on a project. But this show, I saw it at New York Theater Workshop. I saw it the week of the Kavanaugh hearings, and it was so emotional for me. And I left, and I have this sort of like very strange, morbid saying, but if I leave the theater and I feel a little bit like a chicken with its head cut off, because I'm like, I don't know where I am, like time and space, I'm just like so overwhelmed by the experience and need some time to digest it. That show sat with me for so long. And when they announced they were going to move to Broadway, I thought, I would really regret not being a part of this piece, which feels so extraordinarily meaningful and so unique in terms of the way it intersects with politics and with the world around us in this moment. And also, that's pretty radical for Broadway when you think about a lot of the work on Broadway. And the work itself is very risky, let alone just taking a project to Broadway is a risk in itself. And I co-produced with two of my dear producing colleagues, JJ Maley and Corey Stolben. And it is this intimate piece. For those of you who don't know, it's written by and starring Heidi Schreck. And she was a debater in high school, and she would debate on the Constitution, and it's actually helped her. She raised all this prize money, which allowed her to go to college. And, she sort of plays the 15-year-old version of herself and then re-examines the Constitution in the current light of being a older woman and really actually realizing how complex this document really is and how many people it does not serve. And the fact that, all of the various layers of seeing it under this current administration. It premiered on Amazon Prime, yes. The live capture in October. And so again, like right before the election, it just felt very intensified. And it is a really extraordinary piece. And then asks the question, at the end, there's a live debate on stage with a actual high school debater. Should we keep or abolish the Constitution? Is it serving us or hurting us? Right. And really trying to think about she talks about the penumbra, the in-between right. space.
Oh, I have that here. I love that. Like that fact that we are stuck between what we can see and what
Yeah.
we can't.
Yeah.
It
Can
feels
we
incredibly relevant to this moment because so much of what we saw on Wednesday was what we could not see, what we thought we
Exactly.
could not see.
Yeah.
And it's exposed right in front of us. And as Heidi says in this piece, the area, the penumbra is getting smaller and smaller.
Mhm.
Or either way, like honestly, like you're able to see everything, or it's feeling a lot more isolating. I think it's both. It's
It
and
is.
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
would just say from a, you know, the sort of economic perspective, folks were like, either this show is like a runaway hit because like, Constitution's in the title, like are tourists going to understand, like, are they going to care about this very American piece? And turns out, yes, the show was both artistically and financially very successful and recouped, which means it returned the investment to all of the investors. They were made whole again, and then it went into profit. There was a national tour prior to the shutdown, which by all accounts should resume again.
Wonderful.
We have a film version that just came out, and it really, I think, became like precedent setting in a lot of ways. Like you could have an intimate show that is so resonant that it could actually create a profitable experience, and that belongs on Broadway, right? Like prior to this, folks were like, that would never, good as it is, it's not going to be successful on Broadway. And it really shifted the paradigm. And it's really exciting when you think about the future and what's going to be possible in terms of the kind of work we see.
This is something you don't see. I mean, right now we're seeing way more recorded shows than we've ever seen before because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But can you talk about like the accessibility and making that decision? Because I feel like a lot of the times the idea is, well, if it's that easily accessible, no one's going to want to go see it in person.
Totally.
And so financially, it just doesn't make sense. So can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's always been this sort of false assumption that if we give it to people through another medium, then they're not going to want to see it live. It will cannibalize the potential for that sort of like live experience and profitability. And in actuality, that's not true at all. If people love something, like I have friends in the middle of nowhere who just saw Hamilton, right? They've like never seen Hamilton. And they say to me, oh my God, I love this piece so much. When Broadway reopens, like, and I get a chance to go to New York, I can't wait to see it live. And what they found is if you love something that's exposed to you at a more accessible level, then if you love it, you're going to want to experience again in a more meaningful way. So I think that that's going to be a really interesting shift, and we'll see sort of how digital mediums and the live theater can coexist together.
Yeah.
And
that actually,
American Utopia is going to be an interesting example of that. I think you're going to say that, Keith, because it's going to come back to Broadway, and now it's on HBO. Is that right?
My dad and I love the Talking Heads, so when he wanted me to watch this, I was like, it's like a concert piece, I like play, and I watched it and I devoured it. You should all go watch American Utopia on HBO Max. Like, talk about a man creating like an original piece of art. But I wanted to say very quickly, like in response to the notion that people won't go to see a play if they see it like on a screen. I had the experience that sort of catalyzed theater for me in many ways was seeing the producers on screen at 10 years old, and then seeing it a year later on Broadway. Because, well, one, there had been a lot of like rhetoric in my childhood about like Judaism and all that, and seeing all those, like seeing that rhetoric implicated and questioned was not only hysterical to me. I don't know how well it ages, obviously, but like I do know that in that moment, all I wished was that I could be in front of a stage watching that in that moment. So
Absolutely.
I know that for people
Yeah.
that's a falsehood.
Yeah, my version of that is Phantom of the Opera. I grew up with like the Gerard Butler movie, which apparently doesn't hold up to people. I think it's great still, but like that might get me canceled from
You
the.
just have the nostalgia for it.
Exactly. That's what everyone tells me. So the
Wow.
Gerard Butler film, I grew up with it. I would watch it all the time. All I ever wanted to do was see that, and I grew up in South Texas where there is no professional theater. So the first time a touring production came down, I was there because it was just, and that was like 12 years later. But that's the power of accessibility. I think is that you have the chance to see something, and then it makes you crave it more, I think.
Yeah. And there are only 41 Broadway theaters. It's hard. New York, Broadway is so expensive. And the notion that proximity, like you have to be in New York and you also have to be able to afford to see a show, can actually be leveled in the digital space. It really, I think, what an extraordinary moment for folks to have an entry point into this kind of art that they may have not had even thought about seeing before. And now that it's available to them, they're like, oh, I'll check it out. And then, I spent a lot of time as a kid watching those PBS live captures, just because I saw original Into the Woods, and every time I love Into the Woods. There's no reason that I wouldn't want to see a new concept. And, it's so exciting to see some of these shows again or have the experience, because when it's live, it's irrepeatable.
Exactly. And I mean, even on that, like the watching falsettos on great performances, for me, that was the first time I hadn't seen anything from that era of like real stories about gay people where they weren't caricatures and all that. And that was a moment where, and seeing Andrew Rannells continue to like sparkle and illuminate and everything that he does, he's like one of the best we got. But I guess I'm wondering for you, we have a similar intersection in the LGBTQ community and the Judaism, the Jewish community. So I'm wondering what activism can be spoken about from you, because obviously we talked about political theater just now. So in this moment for you, what is the line between being an activist and being a creative? And when they intersect, what is good about it and what might not be so good about it?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. Well, I have been so moved by some of the founders of Broadway Advocacy Coalition use the term artivist, which is that you're an actor activist or an artist activist, I should say. And I really see theater as a tool for activism and social change. And for me, as a Jew, I also believe deeply in the concept of Tikkun Olam, which is like repair the world, leave the world better than you found it. And I think that theater can really engender, as a tool, it can engender empathy and compassion and tolerance and create space for civic engagement and deeper conversation, and allow you to take risks in a safe way. Because the story, it feels like you get to experience perhaps an issue through storytelling, and then be able to sit with it and dialogue about it. And to me, I'm always interested in theater that makes people really think about their lives. I'm not a super like escapist person. I think that work totally serves a purpose, but I'm interested in like meaningful work that I'm going to leave and I'm going to think about, like this reminds me of this particular moment, or actually I've had a similar experience. And every single individual is going to have, because it's art subjective, their own interpretation of that work based on their own life experience and where they come from and who they are. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity in that for real change. And, one of the best examples of that to me is Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, which is a work about the AIDS epidemic, but Larry Kramer himself, who very recently passed away this past year, would stand outside handing out ACT UP flyers. This is like, the AIDS epidemic is not over. We still have work to do. You know, the work is never over. There's always going to be more work. There's always going to be another generation that's going to pick up the mantle. And that's like the piece I'm currently developing called Suffragist, which is about the women's suffrage movement and sort of using suffrage as a case study for how social movements are sustained. And that was that took 3 generations, and that work was not over because, as we know, the 19th Amendment in many ways only gave the vote to white women. And here we are now in sort of this intersectional feminist third wave and continuing this fight. And so I think that in some ways is also is both sort of sad and also beautiful, that both of those truths can exist, in that, like, you will never accomplish everything you set out to do because there will always be more that you don't even know about.
So we're coming up on time, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we met during the 24-hour Plays Nationals. And I would love to just kind of, hear your thoughts and, talk to you a little bit about your involvement with the 24-hour Plays and young producers in general.
Coleman Ray Clark and I have become buds, sort of virtually, actually, over this past year.
Way.
And he had asked me if I would come and speak to the group of producers for the 24-hour Plays. And I just feel so excited about even those producers who are younger than me and the ideas they have, and wanting to really be able to mentor and give of myself so that, they're able to really take hold of this industry, because producers, it's a responsibility. You are in a position of leadership. And in particular, as a white woman, I'm really trying to give my time and energy to emerging producers of color and ensure that they feel confident in continuing to create and produce exciting theater for years to come. And so that was my introduction to 24-hour Plays really this past year. And I got to work with a number of next gen folks.
I think everybody on this call can say that they've made some virtual friends that they haven't met in person, who they have shockingly sustainable relationships with, perhaps
Totally.
more sustainable in some ways than some of the relationships they've created before this happened. Like, I would say that about Ryan. Ryan and I met because I was an actor in the cohort, and I liked his vibes. So I slid into his DMs and I was like, hey man, like, I think like we could work together on something. And this podcast had already existed, and I ran into a place where I needed help. I couldn't edit everything myself. I couldn't produce everything myself. My work was far too important to me to like be stubborn about it and try to control it all. So giving up that control to like somebody I trust and met over the internet. I still haven't met him. He's still just like a square to me.
It's just great. And so for anyone that's, listening and everything, make sure to check out the 24-hour Plays and the 24-hour Plays Nationals. Like we mentioned, that's where Keith and I met, young professionals under the age of 25. And some awesome producers come out of it, and some awesome producers talk to the cohort, which is wonderful.
Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. You all can check out What the Constitution Means to Me on Amazon Prime. You can follow Rachel at RachSuss, Ryan at Ryan Duncan Ayala, and follow A Star's Board at starisboard.pod. So thank you so much for talking with us, Rachel. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here and for listening. And thank you both for such a meaningful conversation today.